In my last video, the data strategy conversation, I talked about all the high-level conversations that we need to have for an effective and successful data strategy. For this video, I'm changing gears. Rather than talking about conversations from a high level, I'm going to dive deep down into the dynamics of a good, deep data conversation. But before we do, let's take a step back and see how people are currently managing conversations. Some conversations are very political, where there's empire building, saber rattling, and people who are strongly positioned, verbally duking it out between each other. And then there are conversations that are much less hostile, where people are willing to discuss all the options, collaborate, and reach a consensus. And then there are other conversations, strictly oriented to information collection and interviewing, where people gather all the information and make it fit into a unifying model. Now, in your organization, in your teams, in your discussions, what style of conversations do you have? Are your discussions political, collaborative, model-driven, a combination of all three? For deep data conversations, we need to do all three, and we need to manage all three of these different styles of discussions under one conversation. And that requires careful planning and orchestration. But what would the fundamentals of this plan look like? Would we use a meeting process? Would we pull things from neuro-linguistic programming or from Myers-Briggs and Berkman? Would we have training sessions and readiness sessions to prepare us for the deep data conversation? When you look at all these options and study them, you'll find several threads of commonality. Commonality around participants and commonality around how these participants behave. I'm Chris Bahura, and welcome to my channel, Breaking Status Quo. I'm going to do a deep dive into the data conversation and outline how the various participants in this conversation interact with each other. I can't go into all the interactions, but I can go into a few key ones which are crucial to the effectiveness and success of your deep data conversation. Let's begin. Let's begin with the frontliner. The frontliner is our eyewitness, our observer, someone that has evidence that there is a problem that needs to be solved, a problem that needs to be discussed. Our frontliner is direct, honest, and ethical, often a high producer that really sticks to their guns. These are the people in the trenches, knowing which way the wind is blowing. For the problem to be addressed, the frontliner needs to be part of the same conversation as an advocate. An advocate is someone who is a politician, someone who is strongly positioned in the organization, often acting as the deep data conversation sponsor. An advocate interfacing directly with the frontliner can be problematic. Advocates are used to fighting political battles, where debating, credibility, and positioning are the key tools. Advocates do not discuss facts and evidence. Instead, advocates are concerned about how their current conversation translates to their political position. Think of a verbal version of Game of Thrones. Rather than losing your life, you'll lose your reputation and credibility. And with the advocate, there's no second chances. So we need a translator. We need a philosopher. The philosopher is someone that translates, that reconciles the advocate's political position to the problem that the frontliner is observing. The philosopher is well versed in organizational structure, culture, and strategy. They widen the deep data conversation by including other political positions, other problems within the conversation. And they can hold a variety of positions, ranging from executive to director, program manager to project manager, or even be an analyst. In Star Trek, it's Captain Picard and Captain Kirk. In Star Wars, it's the Jedi, Yoda, Obi-Wan, and that guy in the dark helmet. For a good deep data conversation, the philosopher must help reframe the advocate's political position to a series of outcomes. The philosopher must also protect the frontliner. Protect the frontliner's ethics, credibility, and reputation. Because the philosopher focuses on widening conversations, more often than not, the philosopher makes the conversation so wide that it's very difficult to manage. So enter the modeler. The modeler helps narrow the conversation. Think of the modeler as a data-oriented philosopher, but rather than reconciling things together, the modeler focuses on fitting things together, fitting models together. Models that help introduce prediction, forecasting, estimation, and scenarios into the deep data conversation. Spock and Data from the Star Trek universe are excellent modelers. The modelers rely heavily upon the philosophers to ensure that the models are wide enough, complete enough, and effective enough for the business. Now, the final crucial participant for the deep data conversation is the follower. The follower supports a specific participant involved in the deep data conversation. The follower executes on what has been discussed. If big data and data-driven is a new initiative, the follower will support the advocate. If the outcome of the deep data conversation involves a change in values or principles for the whole organization, the followers will internalize those values and principles and promote them accordingly. If the outcome of the conversation is strategic change and culture change, the followers will support the philosophers. If big data and data-driven is a stable initiative, followers will support the modelers. And it's decided that a temporary solution or a band-aid solution would work best, the followers will support the frontliners. Who the followers support depends heavily upon the nature and outcome of the deep data conversation. Let's end this video on a quick walkthrough of how all these participants interact with each other. For the sake of clarity, we will not include the followers in the walkthrough. Let's begin. Here's the scope of the conversation we need to have. Let's put what the frontliner needs to talk about deep in the details. Let's put what the advocate wants to talk about at a higher level. Now the philosopher bridges the communication gap between the advocate and the frontliner. The philosopher widens the conversation and reframes the advocate's political position and the frontliner's problem. The philosopher expands the conversation to include other political positions and expands the conversation to include other problems. The modeler uses models to narrow the conversation. The philosopher helps widen the model to be relevant to the conversation and relevant to the business. This is as far as I'm going to take it into the deep data conversation. How do you do your deep data conversations? How do you go about it? Let's continue our discussion in the comments. Thanks for listening.